Does your support hand placement affect how much muzzle rise you're going to see? Well, let's find out. Let's break down the two techniques and why most people probably use them. So the first being over the top of the scope, and the second being holding the front of the bag while pushing down on the front of the rifle at the same time. Now, most people most likely go over the top of the scope because they have nowhere to place their hand on the side of the rifle. They either have no weights or they have a slick side with a very thin aluminium frame at the top, and it simply is impossible to push down or hold the front of the rifle that way. In my case with this stock, I can somewhat do it. I am touching the barrel when I do it, but because it's thick here, I do have somewhere to place my thumb, kind of. If I had external weights and I could push down on the external weights, then that would be perfect, and it would be much easier to do than how it is at the moment. So in this instance, for example, it's way easier to just go over the top, which is why I assume most people do it. The other reason is the length of your arms and fundamentals. Now, fundamentals dictate that when I interface with this rifle at all times, whether it's side on or looking down from above, I need to be square with the rifle at all times. I need to create a letter T. So I need to be perfectly square with the rifle, and it needs to be 90 degrees from my shoulders. So when I interface with it, I'm perfectly square. Now, for my instance, and I don't want to make this video about me, but in my instance, for example, putting my arm as far forward and straight as I can only barely just reach the front of the bag. It isn't really possible for me to do, and that's with this slammed all the way in, my length of pull as short as it goes, and it doesn't really work for me without blading my shoulders and compromising my fundamentals. So for me, I've always just gone over the top of the scope because I have nowhere to hold on the side of the rifle that isn't at the front of the bag and like that. If I had external weights, maybe halfway down the side of the chassis or the stock, I could probably adopt that technique, but it's just simply easier in this instance to go over the top than compromise my fundamentals and go for the front, which is why I assume most people do that, because you need to have quite long arms to be able to achieve that without compromising your fundamentals. But that comes down to you, and if you're able to get away with it without too many detrimental effects when it comes to your wobble when you're on a prop, because your wobble will not be neutral if you're bladed, and the rifle will obviously manipulate your poor fundamentals and it will follow the path of least resistance. And if you're bladed, it's always going to glance off to the side because you're not square with the butt pad. So it is personal preference. It does come down to technique mostly, and how you're able to achieve a good sight picture based on the technique that you adapt and how good you are at that technique. But let's have a look through the scope. I'll shoot both styles back to back, and we'll see if, even though I need to compromise my fundamentals to achieve it, I can still have good sight picture without anything too negative happening, and compare that to my technique of going over the top of the scope and see if there's any benefit to doing that, see if it's any easier, and compare it to over the top of the scope. So what I can tell from doing this test, I don't see any benefit to either method. From what I can tell, how good you are at either technique is what's going to determine your performance when it comes to your sight picture. So it certainly was easier to hold the front of the bag and hold the rifle down in order to achieve a neutral sight picture, but it doesn't feel natural and it feels very forced, and I don't like it because I need to blade my body so much in order to achieve it. So on a prop that's got some wobble in it, I'm going to have negative effects because of that. So that's why I don't do it, and that's why I've never done it with this rifle setup. Depending on what setup I move to the future will depend on if I change, because it certainly is easier, and just leverage dictates that it always will be easier. If you're holding the bore and as far forward as possible, it is going to be easier to control muzzle rise than holding closer to the rear of the rifle. But if you simply can't do it without negative effects, recoil being exploited or increasing wobble, then it's not really an option for you. Which is why most people do go over the top of the scope. And as you can see from the footage, with good technique, it doesn't really have any, performance benefits or detriments to either technique. It comes down to, are you good at your technique? Do you practice it? And that will show, with your performance when it comes to your sight picture. So I feel very comfortable going over the top of the scope. I control muzzle rise quite well. If anything, I push down too hard sometimes, and that creates negative muzzle rise. But that's just me and my lack of practice. As you can see today, everything's a swamp, and I don't enjoy shooting in the swamp at the moment. So yeah, like I said, from what I can tell, it comes down to technique. I don't see one being better than the other. That's certainly not the case at all. It is easier to go front of the bag, but how far forward you can put your hand, that depends on how long your arms are. And yeah, if you do decide to do it, even though you are compromising your fundamentals, what are the negatives? How much can you minimize those negatives, and what can you get away with? But yeah, like I said, practice, technique, that's what comes down to it. That's the most important in this. And there's certainly not a black and white. If you hold the front of the bag, you're good, and if you go over the top of the scope, you suck. That's not a thing. Anyways, we'll see you in the next one, guys.